Welcome everyone to our webinar on the Federal Voucher Program. I'm Judy Solano, Chair of Advocates for Public Education Policy, or we call ourselves A for PEP. Our organization's mission is to support and protect the public education system in Colorado. We are sponsoring this webinar to help others understand how serious this federal voucher program is and how it will hurt both the funding for our public schools and create a cycle of decline in support for public education in general. The new federal tax credit voucher program is a direct attack on our public education system. Colorado has already said no to vouchers 3 times when the public had a chance to voice their opinion. Unfortunately, the federal legislation stipulates that the decision to opt into this voucher program rests with the governor in each state, not through a vote of the people. As a former state legislator, I am keenly aware of how important it is for citizens to speak out and let their voice be heard when political decisions are being made at the state level. I hope you'll join with me in sharing the information you hear this evening with your friends and colleagues. We can work together to convince Governor Polis that this federal voucher scheme is not something we want for our students, our families, and in our state. Dr. Mike DeGeer, our Vice Chair of A for PEP, will be facilitating a conversation with 5 expert panelists. Many thanks to each of them for taking the time to share their expertise on this critically important issue.
Thank you, Judy. Thanks again to all our attendees this evening. As we said, our webinar is being recorded. It will be available in a few days on the A4PEP website, which is going to be in the chat for those of you who don't know how to find that. We're going to be hearing from our panelists shortly, and at the end of our discussion, we'll have a brief Q&A session. Feel free to place your questions in the Q&A section in the Zoom. Starting us off will be Patrick Kremen, who works at the Education Law Center in New Jersey. Patrick is a lawyer who supports the center's litigation and advocacy efforts through the Public Funds Public Schools campaign. Next, we'll be hearing from Beth Lewis, the director of Save Our Schools Arizona. A former teacher, Beth is especially knowledgeable on the impact that vouchers have had in her state for the past 20 years. Following their presentations, we'll be having a conversation with 3 Coloradans who will discuss this topic further, highlighting how this federal voucher program could impact students, families, and public schools in our state. Kevin Wellner is the professor emeritus and research professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder and the director of the National Education Policy Center there. Chris Stifler is an economist with the Colorado Fiscal Institute and a part-time adjunct professor of economics at the University of Denver. And last but not least, State Representative Eliza Hamrick serves in the Colorado House, representing House District 61, located in Arapahoe and Douglas County, and she's a former high school teacher. Patrick Kremen's going to start us off. Patrick, if you would, start us off by sharing some of the background regarding the federal voucher legislation. Why was this tax credit voucher inserted into the budget bill? Who are the groups behind this effort? And what does the tax credit voucher bill entail? Those are the kind of broad questions we're going to start with to kind of get some background. Thank you again, Patrick, for being here.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me and for the kind introduction. A lot to cover in my 10 minutes. Let me pull up my slides momentarily. I hope you all can see my slides. Thanks again for the opportunity to be here. My name is Patrick Kremen. I'm a staff attorney at the Education Law Center, where I support our litigation and advocacy efforts, mainly through our Public Funds Public Schools campaign, which works to ensure that public funds for education are used to support and strengthen public schools. ELC is a legal nonprofit based in New Jersey. We pursue justice and equity for all public school students across the nation by enforcing their right to a high-quality education in safe, equitable, and non-discriminatory learning environments. To achieve these goals, we engage in litigation, research, policy advocacy, communications, and strategic partnerships around the nation. ELC also directs our Public Funds Public Schools, or PFPS, a national campaign to oppose the diversion of public funds to private educational uses, including all forms of private school vouchers. Today, I'll be focusing on three topics: the expansion of voucher programs at the state and federal level, an overview of the federal voucher program that we're here to discuss today, and its implications for states like Colorado, for families, and for students.
Patrick, is it
Um,
that you can have your slides larger, or is that something you can do? I don't know if
oh,
that's possible. We can see them, but we just only see a smaller version. It doesn't matter. We can still follow with it. Just checking.
I'm sorry about that. I apologize.
That's okay. It looks good. We just wanted to see if we could see it a little bit bigger.
One moment.
I
Is
see.
that,
There we go. Perfect.
did that work?
It does. Thank you.
Okay, apologies for that. Thanks, everyone.
No problem.
Um, as I mentioned, I'm going to first talk about the expansion of state voucher programs as a precursor to the federal voucher program. Um, To define them, private school vouchers divert public funds, which should be used to support public schools and other public goods, to private educational expenses. State level voucher programs have expanded to more than half of all states, with 18 states now having universal voucher programs, meaning that there's no income limit or other requirements for students to be eligible to receive vouchers in those states. The enactment or expansion of these voucher programs is often happening in states that can least afford them. Universal voucher programs in particular drain billions of dollars a year from public coffers and further underfund public schools that are forced to compete with these programs for limited state resources. And the fiscal consequences of state voucher programs are even more dire given proposed cuts to federal education funding, which often supports the most vulnerable students. The education funding map from ELC's Making the Grade report shows that many states with universal or near universal voucher programs have lower levels of state funding, state and local education funding compared to the national average. Colorado, while not a voucher state, received a C grade for overall school funding level and was graded as an F in its funding effort, which is its education funding as a percentage of state GDP. So Colorado's public school students would be harmed even further by diversion of already too limited public funds away from public schools. And it should also be noted that voucher programs are highly unpopular and have never been enacted or upheld when put directly to voters. As those of you here well know, Colorado voters alone, and which Judy has mentioned, have defeated vouchers 3 times, most recently in 2024. However, despite their unpopularity, voucher programs are often pushed by pro-voucher groups backed by wealthy donors. And when state legislators oppose vouchers, they often face well-funded primary challenges. The stated goal of many of these voucher supporters is to erode public education, and whether they say it or not, that is the effect of voucher programs. The federal voucher scheme now seeks to expand vouchers to all 50 states, even those that have previously rejected them. I want to give some background on the types of voucher programs that we see across states. Um, Private school vouchers, while they come in many forms, like education savings accounts or tax credit vouchers, they all accomplish the same goal, which is to divert public funds to private schools. I've highlighted tax credit vouchers here since that's the type of voucher program enacted at the federal level. Under this type of program, the state or here the federal government provides individuals with a tax credit in the federal voucher scheme, a 100% tax credit for contributions to private organizations that hand out vouchers. And these organizations are known as scholarship granting organizations or SGOs. This strategy of renaming or shape-shifting voucher programs is often a deliberate strategy by voucher supporters to obscure their true nature, to try to avoid legal challenges and community opposition, especially given the fact that vouchers are so unpopular with voters and often lead to harms to the students that use them and to the public schools that lose funding as a consequence to these programs. Okay. And as to the federal voucher program, as I mentioned, um, state voucher programs have expanded across the nation, and indeed, federal legislation that diverts federal funds to private schools date back several decades. But these efforts reemerged aggressively during the first Trump administration. Although no federal voucher program was passed during the first administration, in 2023, the Educational Choice for Children Act, or ECHA, was introduced in the House and Senate and was a precursor to the now enacted federal voucher program. This past July, the federal voucher program was enacted as a tax credit and part of the budget reconciliation process, which only requires a simple majority to pass the Senate. And I'll briefly go over a few of the key features of that program listed on this slide. So first of all, the federal voucher program creates a one-to-one federal individual tax credit of up to $1,700 for cash contributions to scholarship granting organizations that then pass out school vouchers. This means that if an individual contributes $1,700 to an SGO, the federal government will credit that individual the full amount of $1,700 when they filed their federal taxes. And this is the only federal tax credit that fully reimburses contributors. Of course, this is not free money to states, which some supporters have said. These funds, if they were actually collected by the federal government, could of course be used for public education and other public goods. Plus, states that participate will likely incur other administrative costs to implement and operate vouchers in their state. Second, states that want to participate must opt into the program, as Judy mentioned at the start. The decision to opt in resides with state governors or another entity designated by state law to make such decisions about federal tax benefits. And because of this language, we've seen bills introduced in state legislatures that attempt to force governors in their state to opt in. PFPS is tracking these developments on our nationwide voucher bill tracker, which is on our website and linked at the end of our slides. States have until January 1st, 2027 to opt into the program. That's the first year in which this program will be operational. But many states, including Colorado, have indicated their intent to opt in. However, they need to opt in on an annual basis. So opting in for the first year of the program also does not require opting in for future years. In terms of who's eligible for these programs, students are eligible under three conditions. First, if they reside in a state that opts in, if their family income is not greater than 300% of the area median gross income, and three, they are eligible to enroll in public school. I should mention that the income threshold of 300% of the area median gross income means that many wealthy families, including those making over $400,000 in some Colorado counties, will be eligible for their children to receive federal vouchers, even when students did not ever attend public school in the first place. So as we've seen in state experiences, I'm sure as Beth will talk about, these vouchers often go to wealthy families with students who are already participating in private schools. The federal voucher program will likely be no different. These eligible expenses can be used for tuition, tutoring, special ed services, books, and other expenses for students enrolled at private, religious, or public schools. And while there's a possibility that the program will allow SGOs to give to students attending public schools, we don't yet know what constraints may be put on that option under Treasury Department regulations. And a recent notice put out by the Treasury and the IRS describing proposed regulations casts serious doubt on the ability of states to direct these funds to public schools only. In addition, the services for public school students that these vouchers would potentially pay for are generally services that public schools should provide under their constitutional and statutory rights to an adequate education paid for through the state's school funding formula. And quickly on SGOs, these are 501c3 organizations that give out at least 10 vouchers to students and can only give out vouchers to students in the states in which they operate. But again, under the IRS notice, we are seeing that there may be multi-state SGOs that will be very powerful under this federal voucher scheme and be able to give out vouchers beyond the state in which they operate. SGOs are not required under the statute to ensure that private schools comply with civil rights laws or quality and accountability standards, teacher certification mandates, and there's no requirement in the statute for SGOs or private schools to report relevant student data. And finally, the program includes no spending caps, so the cost to the federal government in lost tax revenue, while it will depend on the number of states that opt in and the number of individual contributions, some initial estimates indicate that the federal voucher program could become the biggest source of federal education spending, larger than both Title I and the IDEA, and the program could balloon in cost over time, as we've seen in numerous state voucher programs. And to finish up on some key implications for states of this program. As we know, voucher programs threaten funding for public schools, and this program in particular does not constitute free money to states. It takes away federal tax dollars that should be used for public education or other public services to instead reimburse individual contributions to voucher granting organizations that support private and religious schools. And when students leave public schools to take a voucher, their districts also lose critical state and local funding, but still have to support the fixed costs to run schools, such as capital maintenance, maintaining libraries, and maintaining their long-term contracts. And in addition to potentially diverting billions of dollars from public schools, this program will allow funds to be diverted to private and religious schools that exclude or otherwise discriminate against vulnerable student groups, particularly students with disabilities and LGBTQ+ students, and the statute provides very few oversight or accountability standards for the program. Even though the statute permits contributions to be used for some public education expenses, these are services, as I mentioned, that should be paid for through the state's school funding formula. Again, I just want to reiterate that the ultimate goal of this program and state voucher programs is to expand school vouchers and divert public funds to private education across all states, even those like Colorado that have already rejected them, in an effort to erode public education. I just want to conclude with some resources and advocacy that we at PFPS have put out to encourage our state partners to use to urge their states and their governors to opt out of the program. I'm happy to share these slides afterwards or connect with folks. Please reach out at our website, pfps.org, or email us. And with that, I will conclude and thank you all.
Patrick, thank you so much. You've given us a lot of rich information and probably some important topics to dive into with the rest of our panel, especially the topic of free money, because that is the phrase that's being used by our governor as to why we should opt into this program. But I really appreciate the background and his resources from the Education Law Center. Several of them are in the chat, and we'll have those available, as we said, on the website that we have. Next, we are going to be hearing from Beth Lewis. Beth, you're in Arizona. You've had vouchers for, oh my goodness, 20 years or more. Can you please share the impacts they've had on the public schools there, on families and students? Talk about the challenges, abuses, concerns, and what about these SGOs? I know you call them STOs down there, but what are they? How do they work? Are there problems with them? And what are we opening up here if this happens somehow across the country? Thank you so much, Beth, for being here.
Well, thank you, Mike. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Friend of mine joked before I went to Pennsylvania last week, what are you, like the voucher angel of doom? And I reject that, but it's really important for us to get out here and tell states like Colorado, states around the country, just what it looks like when state legislatures, when these federal vouchers, when they pass, and what they do to our local public schools. So thanks for having me. I'm one of the co-founders of Save Our Schools Arizona and our network. We are a nonpartisan community-based org that is fighting for strong public schools in Arizona and around the country. So I think Patrick laid this out really well. I just kind of want to put a fine point on it from our perspective too. A voucher is a voucher. If anybody says it's not a voucher, if it's moving public funds to non-public schooling, it's a voucher. If it walks like a voucher and quacks like a voucher, it's a voucher. We have multiple forms of vouchers in Arizona. So we're famous for our universal vouchers, which are our ESAs. They stand for Empowerment Scholarship Accounts, which is a euphemism for a voucher. And those can be used for private school, micro school, and homeschool expenses, just like the federal voucher. So I think that that's going to be really important to talk about. And then we also have an STO voucher, which is set up just like these SGOs that the federal voucher relates to. So we have multiple forms of state vouchers. We're hoping to also stave off a federal voucher, just like you all, and are working really hard to that end. Arizona is the voucher petri dish. Unfortunately, a lot of these bad ideas have been grown in our backyard and are being spread across the country. We're sorry. We've really tried to fight them. We were the very first state to have a voucher pass, and that was the STO tax credit in 1998. That is the current STO. It's only expanded over time. It's gone from just a couple of $1 million a year to hundreds of millions of dollars a year. That is no longer going to our general fund and is just a tax credit for the rich. And then, there have been a lot of other attempts across Arizona. In 2009, the courts ruled a straight voucher, just paying money to the private school, unconstitutional, but they didn't stop, right? They came back in 2011 and passed an ESA so that, they weren't satisfied with just the tax credit. And I think this is important because this is what's happening elsewhere. And also in Colorado, I want to make sure that everybody understands that nobody will be satisfied with just the federal voucher, right? The voucher vultures stop at nothing. Our legislature expanded the ESA program bit by bit by bit and tried to pass universal vouchers in 2017, but in 2018, voters rejected it by a 2-to-1 margin, similar to Colorado. And yet they came back 4 years later and passed universal vouchers, discarding the will of voters. So I think you can kind of see the playbook that is really utilized by anybody pushing vouchers in any state. We aren't unique. This is the playbook. Now that we have universal vouchers, we've had them for 3 years on top of our STO program. The ESA officially, as of yesterday, enrolls over 100,000 students, which means 1 in 10 of our students, nearly double any of our school districts. And that unfortunately means that it is now costing our state over $1 billion per year, which we absolutely cannot afford. And STOs are over 230 million, also, which we cannot afford. And it's important to note that STO vouchers, just like the federal voucher, can be stacked in an unlimited manner. So I'll talk about that in a minute. So this is, to Patrick's point, this is taking out a huge chunk of our budget that should be going to shore up our public schools. You can see these skyrocketing costs. I didn't go all the way back to 1998, but this is a snapshot from 2012. You can see that the share of ESA dollars has really ballooned since universal expansion, but that hasn't impacted the STO dollars. And combined, we're at 1.3 billion this year alone. All right, so vouchers in Arizona. What do they fund? I think a lot of folks around the country, when we think of a voucher for private schools, we think of maybe a cute kid in a plaid uniform, going to a fancy private school. That's a small part of it here, but the vast majority of these expenses are actually going to new schools, which are subpar strip mall schools and schools, micro schools that are operating in living rooms without certified teachers, right, with no safety standards. We've also got folks that are spending this, specifically homeschool families that are trying to use AI to call certain things educational by creating curriculum for them. So a great example is a family said, my kid wants to be a barista. I put together a barista curriculum, and I think we should be able to buy an $800 espresso machine with our ESA dollars. And this is what we can expect under a federal voucher, because federal vouchers do go to homeschool families. And regulations, the guidelines haven't come out, but we don't expect to see any sort of crackdown or guardrails here.
Beth, before you leave that slide, I have to ask a question. How is it that there's no oversight or accountability for the money? It just is mind blowing when I read this slide. Can you clarify that, can you speak to that briefly?
Of course, yeah. So the law just simply says that it should be for educational expenses, and the program is so huge. Families basically submit for reimbursement to our Department of Education. They submit receipts, and our Department of Education has a non-public school leader in charge, and he has just decided to auto approve anything under $2,000 and says, we'll audit later. So recent investigative reports have shown that even things like lingerie and diamonds have been purchased as
Wow.
educational expenses. People are using it to, gymnastics lessons, tennis, American Ninja Warrior, you name it. And they can teach anything they want. Recently, a micro school announced that it was teaching flat earth curriculum, and taxpayers are funding that in Arizona. With STO vouchers, again, we've had them for 26 years. So we kind of wrote the book on these SGOs or STOs. Here they're called school tuition organizations instead of scholarship granting organizations. It's all the same thing. They're clearinghouses. So basically they take in all the tax credit dollars and then they distribute them as scholarships, but they keep 10% for admin costs. They can hire anybody they want. They can hire their wife, their son, their grandma. And they, here our Senate president was responsible for expanding STOs, and he owned an STO, and he got himself, the joke was, a new Lexus every year. He hired his wife, he hired his nephew. It's a total grift. It's a dollar for dollar tax credit, just like the federal voucher. And we talk about, this money is not free. No money is ever free. But like Patrick said, this dollar for dollar tax credit is extremely unique in the way that it operates. And it siphoned $230 million in Arizona funding that should have gone to our general fund. We have no insight as to how many scholarships or how many students are benefiting. We don't know how much money each student is receiving. And so, that could be anywhere from, I don't know, $500 to $50,000 per child. The public has no idea. And again, there's no accountability, there's no academic results. And we know that these schools that are signed up for the STO program can pick and choose their students, and they absolutely do. Many of them say in their handbooks that they do not serve students with disabilities. They do not honor IEPs and 504 plans. Many of them are religious and say that they do not, they have statements of faith that students have to sign on to that would prohibit students from being gay in their schools. And I think I've gone over this, but just to belabor the point, there are no standards for these voucher schools. Nobody's looking over their shoulder. We have no idea if kids are safe. There are no background checks or fingerprinting. There's no curriculum standards. There's no requirement that a school be accredited or that a teacher be certified. It's truly the Wild West out here. And that is what we see when we look at the statutes governing the federal voucher. So my last couple points, we hear a lot about school choice. I'm just here to tell you it has nothing to do with school choice. The vast majority of students that use any of these vouchers were already in private school. They could already afford private school. They tend to be more white, more affluent, in higher income zip codes. And so this is just, vouchers are a bunch of money that is now off the table for students who need it most. Students in low income areas, students of color, students who are LGBTQ who can't get into these schools, students who are English language learners, and our rural students. None of them are benefiting. They're all missing out. It creates a two-tiered system that is segregative, and it hurts public schools. And you'll hear a lot of folks try to say, you can have both. You can have a voucher system and you can also have well-funded public schools. And I'm here to tell you that that is not possible and it's not the goal. They're trying to dismantle our public schools. And so I just pulled out some clips for you all to see the devastating impacts that vouchers have had on our schools. So we've got bus route cuts, we've got elimination of social workers, district after district is cutting jobs. And now our districts are shutting down schools en masse. 70% of the schools shut down so far are Title I. And we just see our headlines are just truly chock-a-block full of school closure, a third of the campuses, and it's not stopping. Another one was announced today. So things are bad in Arizona, and it was designed that way. We know that this federal voucher is no different. It is designed to accelerate privatization. It is designed for states like Colorado who reject vouchers to find a backdoor way to get them into your state. So I truly, really, truly recommend that you fight it with everything you've got. The tax credit voucher will always, it's designed for the rich. It's always going to benefit the rich. And, we know that the federal voucher will disperse funds for homeschool and micro school, as well as private school, which means everything that you just saw from Arizona, that Wild West approach with no transparency is what you can expect. And again, there's no such thing as free money with this program, because we know the goal is to privatize public education.
Very thorough, very, very scary as heck, to be honest with you, given what you've shared and the history that you've had. Go ahead. Let me see the last part here.
I forgot the last slide. Yeah, I'll just take one more minute. Once vouchers are introduced into your state, like a state like Colorado, we've seen from the behavior of the voucher pushers, they don't stop at anything. They get that foot in the door, they keep inching it wider and wider. There is no compromising, because the goal is the full-scale privatization of our schools. And when you have privatized schools, you no longer have free schools, you no longer have accessible schools, you no longer have inclusive schools, you can't have collective bargaining, right? Everything that we hold dear about public education is gone. So there's never been a better time to stand strong, unite around your public schools, and make sure that your friends and neighbors know all of these dangers. So thank you.
Beth, before we go on to our next speaker, has your governor made any comments or any statements? I don't recall. I know that 9 Republican-led governors have indicated a support for this federal voucher bill. We'll talk about our governor in a minute, but can you speak to where your governor's at, or do you know?
Things are really volatile in our state. Our governor just vetoed our tax conformity bills. The tax conformity bills shoved the federal voucher in the last page. They thought we weren't going to notice it, but she's got a long haul ahead of her. So I think she's taking a bit of a wait and see approach. I'm hopeful that she certainly will not opt in this year.
Good.
And yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be a challenge, I think, across the country, depending on the lobbying that will be happening and the pressure building across from different groups. Chris Stifler, we're going to let you start next, and then we're going to hear from Kevin and Representative Hamrick, Kevin Welder. But I think, Chris, you've got some information you want to share, first of all, related to the impact that this might have, as well as maybe just clarifying. The governor is saying this is a tax credit. He says it's not a voucher. It's not a voucher. Can you speak to that a little bit? And maybe also share why your organization signed on to a letter to the governor with 15 other education advocacy groups urging Governor Polis not to opt in to the tax credit voucher plan. Can you talk about that as well?
Sure, Mike. So there's been a lot of misconceptions and a lot of errors already in this debate. What's a tax credit? What's a deduction? What impacts my federal taxes? What impacts Colorado taxes? What impacts the general fund? What impacts schools? Is it indirect? So basically, Mike brought me in to be the Econ 101 professor. So basically, I'm going to arm you in the next 5 minutes so you can better argue with your Facebook friend who thinks recycling bins cause cancer in house cats.
Thank you, Chris.
That's what I'm going to do. That's my goal in the next 5 minutes. So Go back to July last year, HR 1 passed, and we lost $1 billion in Colorado because HR 1 passed. There was a lot of these things called deductions, like no tax on tips, no tax on overtime. Because we're unique in Colorado, we automatically start with federal taxable income as our starting point. When I do my income tax and everyone does their income tax, we basically automatically import any tax changes into our tax code. So overnight, we lost $1 billion when HR 1 was passed. That has to do with the fact that the difference between adjusted gross income and taxable income. So basically, when you do your TurboTax every year, you add up all the money you make, and then this is the fun part: you do your deductions and exemptions. And maybe if you make $100,000, you might whittle that down into 70,000 taxable income. Okay, what HR 1 did was balloon a lot more of those deductions. And so someone who had $100,000 might only have $50,000 then in taxable income, upon which we multiply our income tax rate here in Colorado. So it's this effect, rolling conformity, and the fact that we start with federal taxable income as our starting point. We had a huge revenue loss. Okay, that was from all these deductions, like no tax on tips. So I want to spell out first, this is actually a credit. So this won't have the revenue impact to Colorado's general fund as, say, no tax on tips, because it was a deduction. So if you do, this is a wonky chart. I'm just going to pull just to show you. The main takeaway here is deductions happen in the middle. They whittle down your AGI into lower taxable income. So a $100 deduction means you then pay $100 less times 4.4% to Colorado. Or say that another way, a $100 deduction is only worth $4.40 in savings for you in Colorado. But a $100 credit is worth $100 to you. So credits are a lot more dollar for dollar than what are deductions. And so this program, as the governor is saying, he's saying it's free money because it is a credit. So to argue his point, it's not a deduction that impacts our taxable base that could hurt the money for our general fund. He's saying it's a tax credit that comes from the federal government, so it won't impact the state general fund, which is true, but I'm going to talk about the indirect impacts that could impact our schools through the school finance formula.
Thank you.
Okay, so there's your state budget. We focus most of our attention on the general fund, but we do get $14 billion. We probably got 900 million for schools last year from the federal government. But mostly when you talk about our state piggy bank, you're basically talking about the general fund. And that's basically where Coloradans throw their income tax and they throw their sales tax. So basically, the general fund is its collective pot of taxes. And then from those taxes, here's actually what we actually bought last year. Or for you to arm yourself against your weirdo on Facebook, every dollar you gave Colorado in taxes, about 30 cents goes to K-12. About 33 cents goes to Medicaid. And then you have higher ed, corrections, and human services round out the bulk of what the general fund does. But that's basically where all our taxes. So when HR 1 passed, we lost $1 billion out of this funding pot that competes with schools, higher ed, roads, and healthcare. Okay.
The big cut.
It gets more complicated with schools because we have both local property taxes and state sources. So that can muddy the conversation. But basically, here's your overall split. About $5.5 billion come from state sources, and then another $4.5 billion come from local property taxes. This can be part of the conversation too, because every school district, public school district, has a unique local property taxes and unique overrides in their funding formula. But I really want to hammer on the direct or the indirect impact. So that's the kind of the argument for the Polis side, that it doesn't have a direct general fund impact like no tax on tips does. And it's a tax credit that's paid for the federal government, so it's not paid for out of general fund or Colorado's budget. But here's the impacts that I'm seeing, and that's through the school finance formula. So the school finance formula basically is this complicated formula that factors in different types of students, different types of cost of living across Aspen's district versus Pueblo's versus Denver versus Steamboat Springs. There's a bunch of different factors that dictate how much your factors are worth, but they get multiplied by your October count. So they basically count every kid in October and how many students you have in the district. That gets multiplied by, say, it varies across district depending on the number of factors, your at-risk pupils, your cost of living, but basically it might be $12,000, $13,000 a student. Okay, so this is the time where superintendents make sure everyone attends that day because they need to get their October count up. It also speaks to the why we've been able to trim a little bit cuts to higher ed, to schools lately by doing a 4-year averaging instead of a 5-year averaging, because a lot of districts have lost enrollment. And so we smooth that over a 5-year averaging. Jumping to a 3-year averaging that's on the table this year would even further hurt public schools that are losing students. But the big takeaway for you to understand is our school finance formula counts all those kids times basically 12,000 bucks. But that kid goes to an SGO and is no longer in the October count. That district then loses $12,000. So it's the indirect impact if you're driving more kids, and then all the data on private schools, they're all around the Front Range, and they're nowhere near rural Colorado. All the data says, you lose those kids, you suddenly lose 3 or 4 kids to a private school. That's a teacher's salary that you've lost through the school finance formula because those kids are no longer part of the October count, multiplied by $12,000, and there's your real funding damage to the district. So the message I'd like to leave you, we've wrote some stuff on this. We've opposed a lot of these voucher things. Basically, I love the quack like a duck type stuff. I've used the joke, it doesn't matter what you call them vouchers, call them education savings accounts, call them tax credits, call them scholarships to Hogwarts. Whatever you call them, we're against moving creative ways to move public dollars into private schools at the expense of our public schools.
Very well said. Chris, I think what I'm hearing you say is every kid who leaves the public school equals about $12,000 that's no longer available, period. I mean, and if this program encourages that to happen, we're losing more money in every one of our potentially in our public schools. That's what my takeaway was. I don't know if that's a good summary. I love your quack like a duck phrase, though. Thank you for putting a little bit of humor there. But I appreciate the fact that the Colorado Fiscal Institute joined with 15 other organizations pleading with Governor Polis not to opt into this program. Thank you for giving us that message. All right, let me open it up now to Kevin Wellner, our expert on many issues, especially this one. Kevin, you recently wrote an article in the Colorado Sun with State Board of Education Kathy Gebhardt about the federal voucher plan, and you stated that the federal voucher plan is a devil's bargain, that it must not override the will of the people. Can you share more about that concern and talk about the scholarship granting organizations? I mean, as far as I know, we have 3 at least in our state right now, but they're all giving money to children to go to private or religious schools. I mean, can you fill us in a little bit more about this devil's bargain that we're dealing with? What's it all about here?
Sure. So what Kathy and I were talking about is the issue of the federal regulations that was touched on a little bit by some of the earlier speakers. The Treasury Department is in the process of drafting those regulations. The law itself that was part of the Reconciliation Act is a skeletal law and somewhat confusing in some provisions. And so the expectation is that Treasury will come in and clarify everything. And the expectation that Kathy and I have, which is already being borne out, what we're seeing, is that the Treasury Department is on Team Voucher and is going to draw these regulations in a way that is not going to give the states the freedom to be consistent with their obligations to equity, to access, to transparency, to accountability, to supporting public schools, etc. And so our concern is that governors like Jared Polis, who apparently intend to opt in, before the regulations are issued, are effectively signing a blank check and trusting the Trump administration to honestly and reasonably fill in that check. And they won't, right? Donald Trump is not a particularly popular person in Colorado, as we've seen with the initiatives on vouchers. Vouchers are not popular in Colorado. And yet, what we're seeing from the current governor is a willingness to trust in vouchers and also to trust in the Trump administration. I expect that Republican governors will want to collaborate with President Trump and his Republican allies in Congress to expand private school vouchers, but it seems odd for Democratic governors to want to collaborate with Trump. And so that's a concern. Attorney General Phil Weiser, who's running immediately after Polis's statement said, I will not support this. I will not opt in. To my knowledge, Senator Michael Bennet, who's running for the Democratic primary, has not publicly said what his interests are. But anyway, that's where Kathy and I were coming from in terms of the devil's bargain, in terms of the concerns. There was a mention already of the Treasury Department's initial pre-regulation draft request for comments and what's in there. I think we're short on time, so I won't get into some of that, but it's very clear from that request for comments where they are heading. And it is a scary place. The other thing that I wanted to address, to build on some of the comments that were made about the statement that Governor Polis made and that other people have made about this being essentially free money or cost-free, is in addition to the issue about school closures and about loss of per pupil operating revenue and fixed costs and the administrative costs that were raised, I think there are a few other things that when we're talking to our Facebook buddies that we should address. And most obviously, every dollar contributed to an SGO is a dollar taken out of the federal budget, right? That would otherwise be paid in taxes. And this 100% tax credit is, as was mentioned, this is the only donation. It stands alone. This is the only, you could donate to your United Way, to your church, to disaster relief, whatever charity is your favorite, you're going to get that normal deduction from income that Chris was talking about. Not a tax credit, certainly not 100% tax credit, right, from the federal government. So note also the cost of this program was mentioned. There's no cap. Right, the program is open-ended. The estimates that an organization called ITEP put out say that this could cost between $25 and $50 billion annually. Currently, the two biggest federal programs that were mentioned, IDEA and ESEA, or Title I. Title I is an $18.4 billion program. ESEA is a $15 billion program. And again, this is estimated to cost maybe between 25 and 50 billion, right, dwarfing those programs. And the voucher program it barely has, as it was mentioned, it barely has any means testing, up to 300% of the area median gross income, right? So keep in mind that Project 2025 calls for block granting IDEA and block granting and then phasing out Title I, and then spending instead on a federal voucher program. And sure enough, along with this massive voucher program, the Trump administration has been trying to cut down on funding for Title I and other programs to help the nation's most vulnerable students while moving money into this voucher program. So not only is this program likely more expensive, it's also part of an administration effort to shift spending to families with less need. It's clearly not free money, right? It's not free money if we understand that President Trump and Education Secretary McMahon are already eliminating billions in federal spending and threatening to reduce or eliminate Title I. But how will states like Colorado make up for the potential loss of federal funds under Title I and IDEA if federal funding is instead diverted to the tax credit program? And then 4 other quick hits on the cost of this. First, Colorado's public schools are going to be hurt because private schools are not subject to most anti-discrimination laws and will selectively leave behind in public schools those students, including those with disabilities, who are most expensive to educate. That shifts costs to the public schools. Similarly, private schools can push out students mid-year, placing after that October count, right? And they place the expensive and disruptive burdens on local community public schools when students arrive mid-year. And I should add, there's also this issue about, and this gets to Arizona's experience. Arizona, when it passed that I thought it was 97, but I think the law passed in 97 and it started in 98 in Arizona. There was a sister law to the STO law that created the vouchers, the STO vouchers in Arizona. And it was for extracurriculars in public education. And that's been studied. That's been studied fairly well, and you really don't even need the study. This is common sense. Guess which public school districts in Arizona benefited from those donations? It was the public schools in communities with more wealth, right? You donate to the STOs that are in your neighborhood, that are serving your kids, your neighbors' kids, and so it became a rich get richer program in Arizona. Even though we might all be happy about the money going to public schools, it was creating greater inequalities within the public school system. And we would expect to see that there. And so the result of all these patterns and practices will be a cycle of disinvestment from local community public schools. And as fewer students attend those schools, and as the most wealthy and politically powerful families leave those schools, resources and political support decrease. And that leads to additional families opting out, continuing the same cycle. That's the concern, that is the end concern. About why Governor Polis is wrong that this is cost-free. It is definitely not cost-free.
Very thorough, very helpful, and also very scary. You're talking about economic segregation that would be happening in terms of our schooling system, and you're talking about money that literally is going to deplete the federal resources, which would impact IDA and our money that we were getting from the federal government. I mean, this is a long-range plan of Project 2025. It's a Trump plan that's been pushed by the Heritage Foundation for years, and we need to recognize this for what it is. This is mind-blowing and very, very, very eye-opening for those who aren't aware of what's happening. Let me ask you one more question before we go to Representative Hamrick. I don't know how to say this, but how do the SGOs work, Kevin? How would that work in our state if, in fact, I'm seeing something called Parents Challenge, ACE scholarships, and Seeds of Hope. Seeds of Hope has been giving money to children to attend Catholic schools, ACE scholarships to private schools. I mean, how will they decide to just give money to certain families? Or is there any oversight, or how does that play out? Or do you know?
So what we're seeing in the initial documents from Treasury are two things that I think are relevant to that come to mind. One is that we're seeing I think someone earlier mentioned, the multi-state SGOs. That what we're seeing is a group of for the most part, I think they're all pre-existing SGOs. In other words, like the STOs that run in Arizona, or the Step Up for Students in Florida, or the Pennsylvania SGOs that have been around for a while. These are pre-existing entities that oftentimes already have interstate networks. And what they're doing is they are expanding to create, and they are lobbying the Treasury right now to make sure that the laws are going to be favorable to them to do this. They are expanding to become national organizations that will, if we opt in, we'll be seeing their advertisements, right? We'll be seeing a lot of money being put in to pushing donations into these multi-state systems.
Wow.
Now, the truth is that every state has different rules about SGOs, like the 10% rule, in terms of the overhead that we see both in the federal law and in Arizona's, that does not exist in every state. Some states have lesser amounts that they could take, or no amount. And I think in Florida, at least initially, they didn't allow the SGOs to take a cut. Okay. So the SGOs were funded with foundation dollars, or with donor dollars. So the way it might work, that's part of it. The other big part, the other thing that I want to stress based on your question, is that the way the regulations appear to be written, the SGOs are going to be in charge of the program. Right. So if the federal government is hands off, and the federal government regulations keep the states from regulating, which is the other thing I would love to talk about if we have time. I don't think we do.
We might.
But there's a really important role that states should be playing, and these regulations are going to tie our hands. And we're not going to be able to prevent discrimination. We're not going to be able to have accountability rules. We're not going to be able to have transparency rules. We're not going to be able to address issues of quality, et cetera. It all will fall on the SGOs. It's basically going to be an SGO regulated program.
A separate system of funding schools run by SGOs instead of by the state. Is that what you're implying?
Funding private schools, and one of the things that I'll mention in this request for comments that is scary for those of us who would like to see this program benefit public schools, if it's going to exist at all, is that there's an item in there to the effect that the money cannot be used by students. In other words, think about the money goes to the family or to the student, right? And then student then takes it to a vendor, whether it's a private school or a tutor, whoever it is. Well, the hope would be that they could take it to their local public school, right? And the public school then could provide an after-school program or tutoring. And those are categories that are in, it's called the Coverdale categories, which is how the statute was set up to look at the types of expenses that could be used with the old Coverdale expenses. And tutoring and after-school programs are in there. But this request for comment says, well, you can't use this money. Public schools cannot use this money to provide services that they in categories that they would otherwise provide, or something to that effect. The wording is a little bit complicated, but the implication I get from reading it is, well, if you already have tutoring, if you already have if tutoring and after school programs are already part of what a public school would normally provide, then they can't use this money for that purpose. So it's going to tie the hands to do. And by the way, the research on tutoring says that's the most effective, right? It has to be tied to the instruction that for tutoring to be really effective, it has to be tied to the instruction the student is already getting.
So what you're saying is the Treasury regulations, which are still yet being developed and are receiving comments from many pro-voucher groups and others, are going to be tying the hands of states, possibly. When will we get those regulations?
Very likely.
What are we thinking? What are we hearing? March, April?
Spring, probably
Okay.
sometime in the spring, maybe late spring. But.
Representative Hamrick, you're one of our vocal legislators around the issues of education. Thank you so much for your service in our House. And here's my question. How are Colorado legislators reacting to this idea of participating in the federal voucher plan? And especially since the voters said no. I mean, what are you hearing? What are your thoughts? Thank you for being here.
You bet. Thank you for having me. A small handful of representatives and senators, we've been working together over the summer. We've worked with Kevin Wellner and with other really informed people as far as the federal landscape. And so we're reacting, just the handful of us in a way where we need to figure out what guardrails we need to put in place, because the governor said he wants to opt in, right? And the rules will be announced, we think, in March by the Treasury Department. So we worked with Kevin, a handful of senators and myself, and we wrote a letter to the Treasury Department and the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service with suggestions, because we thought, the IRS and Treasury are getting all these letters suggesting what it should look like. And so we really hit hard on respecting federalism, respecting states' control of education, putting tons of guardrails in there, allowing our state to regulate these SGOs, to define the SGOs, to protect civil rights, accessibility, non-discrimination, allow states to add stronger protections. It was already said that in various states, SGOs are seen as different entities. And so we're really trying to get that in Colorado. And we sent the letter, and there were 5 things that we really focused on: preserving genuine state flexibility in decision-making. Again, education is a power of the states, and they should be able to make these decisions about what an SGO looks like, because, as was already said by Kevin and some other people, we're looking at, if we do opt into this, which it looks like we will, looking at public school foundations. Can they be SGOs? And can people donate to their local school foundation? And that's something that we're looking at. Also, we want to be able to regulate SGOs, including guardrails against bad actors, as Beth was talking about in Arizona. We want standardized reporting so that they're constantly looked at, constant scrutiny of these SGOs, and making sure that they're transparent, they're accountable, that there's oversight. Also, again, protecting civil rights and non-discrimination, and then preventing profiteering and inequitable outcomes, including oversized awards to too few students. And so that's the crux of the letter that we sent to the Treasury. And when I speak with my fellow legislators about this, they are all, many of the legislators haven't thought about it. And so this is a small group of us that we're pushing it out. So at this point, we're just informing our fellow legislators about it. And as for the voters striking down vouchers 3 times in Colorado, and the 2015 Colorado Supreme Court case that ruled against vouchers because they said they violate our state constitution, those are arguments against the unconstitutionality of this program in Colorado. But then you also have people saying, well, it's a federal tax credit, it's a charitable deduction. And so there's the other side is talking about that, that the federal government has the authority to sort of operate regardless of state level restrictions, and that we're choosing to opt in. And so that's an argument to support this. So we're trying to put in and really push out guardrails so that we can control the SGOs and make sure that the money gets to the students that really need it.
Rep. Hamrick, I really appreciate your efforts in that regard in sending the letter and trying to get those state control of this federal voucher scheme. But I'm concerned about the one statement you made, which was, it looks like we will. I don't agree with that particularly, because can't the people try to convince the governor otherwise? I mean, I've heard so many reasons tonight why this is not a good plan. And my question to you as a legislator, is there anything that citizens can do to communicate their concerns, their beliefs, especially in light of what we're hearing from the panelists with respect to the devastating impact that's going to have on funding for schools, on access, and every other concern that we've heard? I mean, can this be something that we can try and mobilize our community around to let it be known that this is not something that is going to work for our Colorado families?
Yeah, it's all about education. It's about educating legislators, it's about educating the governor.
Yeah.
And he has, been pretty clear about his desire to opt Colorado in, but you're right. I mean, minds can be changed. People can be informed and educated, and so we, the group in the legislature, the handful of reps and senators, we're looking at all different strategies to try to get this under control. We're even looking at a possible bill to do that, to put all these guardrails in. And so we're talking to the governor and trying to figure out, how we navigate this. But I put my email in so that I would love to have people on the call email me their ideas, and we can keep them in the loop about how we're moving through the session. And if a bill comes to pass, not pass, but if a bill is created, then we'd need people to just really try to be out there with all this great information that we learned today, to educate their legislators and to educate our governor, so that people understand just the threat that this had, this existential threat to public education in the state of Colorado.
And I also heard Kevin say that we have an election in November and we'll be electing a new governor. And the current stipulation is that each year the governor decides whether or not he or she is going to opt into the program. So it doesn't really make sense if you think about it, if we're looking at a lame duck person in charge as to he making that decision for the future, especially since I thought I heard Kevin say that one of the candidates for governor has already said that he would not opt into this program. Is that what I heard you say, Kevin?
Yep, it's true. Wiser.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the legislation. One of the things that Kathy and I wrote about in the Sun piece, and I've written about elsewhere, is that a governor could say, and this is essentially what the governor of North Carolina said, look, in North Carolina, he was sort of forced into it by his legislature. That is a
Republican legislature.
Republicans. But he said, look, I'll opt in, but only after I find out that there are these reasonable regulations that would allow us to give us the flexibility to implement it in a way that is I don't remember what he said, but essentially what I would say for Governor Polis is let us put anti-discrimination provisions into it. Let us put some accountability and transparency provisions into it. Let us put some provisions in to make sure that our public schools are indeed benefiting. And that seems like a sort of a conditional opt-in that would be a lot more reasonable and maybe put some pressure on Treasury to say, look, we don't want to lose states like Colorado. Maybe we have to make this a little bit flexible.
That's one way to look at it. And I appreciate that thinking. Patrick, Beth, or Chris, do you have anything else you want to share based on what you've heard from the other panelists? Any other comments or suggestions for us to think about here in Colorado before we go to any other questions that we have from the attendees?
I was just going to piggyback quickly off of what Kevin just said. Our colleague in Florida, Damaris Allen, did an analysis of all of the recommendations made to the Treasury and particularly looked at the pro-voucher groups. And there are quite a few recommendations that essentially will make it very hard for a state to opt out once it opts in. And I think we need to be really eyes wide open about that. And then to Kevin's point, there are a lot of recommendations that would completely prevent states from ever imposing any guardrails or even non-discrimination clauses. States would truly probably abdicate their power under the vision of the pro-voucher folks that are probably talking to Linda McMahon and the Treasury right now.
Very important point. Patrick, did you have anything you wanted to add? Not to put you on the spot. Okay. Chris, anything?
I just have a personal question. Like, could we limit the SGO definition to include like only after school programs for public school? Like if it was just the Latin club for Denver public schools, that was the definition of SGO. Could we do that?
Any comment, Kevin
Well,
or Beth?
the statute itself doesn't prevent a state from putting that sort of regulation in place. But the Treasury regulations will not allow that. So the way that I was looking at it, just based on the statute itself, is there's let's use the tutoring example in particular. I mentioned the research on tutoring, particularly after the pandemic era, where a lot of the relief money was put into tutoring. We have a really strong research base about high quality tutoring and its effectiveness and how to structure a program like that. So good policy making out of a state might say, hey, there's this new federal tax credit system. It's a way that we could fund something to help all of our students. That tutoring could be for students who homeschool, for kids in private school, for kids in public, it could be for every student across the state. Let's design this to bring in money for high quality tutoring, and we're going to design it and put all sorts of regulations in place to make it work. The statute itself would allow that. There's nothing in the statute that says you can't do that. Depends on how it's interpreted. And the way it's being interpreted by Trump's Treasury Department is not going to allow that.
I think that's a key phrase. Trump's Treasury Department is looking at deciding what's going to be happening in our education programs across the country. And the federalism issue that you brought forward, Eliza, Representative Hamrick, is a real concern. States are in charge of their education systems, but this tax credit voucher plan is undermining that entire philosophy and that long-standing belief that we are in charge of our education system. So I hope we think twice about this, and I do think we should do everything we can to communicate with the governor about these concerns. I want to see if there's any questions in the Q&A. Rob Rogers. Rob, do you have any questions that we need to look at that we might throw to the group right now? Let me just look here. Let's see. Rob? We've got a couple information items. Is there anything, Rob, that you want to throw out from the audience that has come forward before we come to a close, and then ask our audience to please stay involved with this issue if they can? Rob?
There are some interesting questions in here that some of the panelists have kind of touched on. One of them is could you say more about what you're expecting to see in the regulations or the rulemaking that people are lobbying the Treasury Department for right now?
Yeah, I think we heard some of that. If you want to add to that, anybody? Beth, you said you had some information from someone in Florida that is tracking all the comments that are going to Treasury in some way. If you want to just add to that one more time.
Sorry, remind me of the question I was reading. I was responding to Beverly's question to me in the chat. Sorry.
Oh, good for you.
If there was any more details that anyone wanted to share about the regulations or rulemaking that you're expecting.
Anything you've heard from Damaris?
I mean, certainly I think it was Chris who just answered this. I mean, or Kevin, we don't expect states to be able to say that they'll only opt in for public schools. That definitely will not happen. And then Kevin already talked about the supplementing, not supplanting, what's already happening in our public schools. So we anticipate it's going to be impossible to benefit public school students, even if a state wanted to. So.
Okay.
And just to add briefly, the initial request for comments that came out in November was more of an informal request. There will likely be a formal notice and comment period, as Kevin mentioned, when the regulations are put out this spring, as we expect. And so I would encourage, folks on the call to submit a public comment. Advocating for the things that we've been talking about, as PFPS did the first round, as Representative Hamrick and Kevin did the first round. Continue to make your voices heard and submit those public comments.
Yeah, Rob, there's one other question that I was curious about. It says, does Governor Polis have the ability to opt in without the state legislators passing an appropriate legislative bill? Can someone speak to that? Rep. Hamrick?
He does. He does have
Oh.
that power, and Kevin can elaborate more on that.
I mean, it's sort of, there's a catch-22 in that there's a provision that says it could be a different body other than the governor, but in order to change that, you'd have to get it over the governor's veto, right? He'd pass last legislation, he would veto it. So effectively, it's going to be the governor. But again, our governor's office is going to change, right? We're going to have a different governor, even if Beth is correct in that the regulations out of Treasury might make it difficult for a state to opt back out. The Treasury Department is going to change in 3 long years, and there'll be a new a new set of rules that they design. So this is going to be in flux. There's a problem in that there's a political constituency created, obviously, once, and Beth could speak to this about Arizona, I'm sure, that once you have, what is it, you said 10% of the students are using are using a voucher of one sort in Arizona. That 10% and their extended families have a vested interest in maintaining and expanding that, right? And so once we saw with the expansion of vouchers across the country, this camel's nose under the tent, foot in the door approach, where it's like the initial voucher is for students who are in foster care, students with disabilities, students in military families, et cetera, right? And then once that is in place, the next legislative session, there's a bill to expand that to some new group, and then a new group, and then a new group, right? So it's the chart that Beth put up for Arizona. You could see something similar to that in every one of these states. And so once we create that constituency, there'll be more and more of a push here in Colorado also to expand that. And you get into that cycle of disinvestment that I was concerned about.
That's the Trojan horse concern that I also have read about, possibly.
Yeah, it's
All
related
right.
to that.
Yeah. Rob, anything else before we thank our panelists and encourage our listeners to stay involved, especially here in Colorado, as we're trying to communicate our concerns around this federal voucher scheme?
And that's a really good segue to what you had asked me to cover. A4PEP, we have been discussing planning, working for the last several weeks on a campaign of sorts to inform several different types of audiences and constituents throughout the state about this. I'm not surprised, because this whole voucher scheme was kind of buried in the reconciliation bill. It did get passed without a lot of discussion, but there are still a lot of people, even within our advocacy circles, who are not even aware that this is about to happen, and are not really thinking about the the implications for public education, especially in a state like Colorado, where Tabor, it hamstrings the ability of making up a lot of the losses that public school districts could face. So I'm consistently surprised by that, but I'm also very encouraged for some of AFRPEP's efforts and discussions recently, because next week we are going to begin a coherent campaign for notifying the public, for notifying superintendents, for notifying even legislators. Rep. Hamrick obviously is not one of those people that needs to be informed, but there are even legislators that are not aware that this is going on, that are not aware that this is happening, and are not aware of the implications. So we're going to do our best to inform those audiences about this, and we can use all of your help whenever you start to see these messages come out from us from various channels. We're even trying to equip you to have those conversations over the fence with your neighbor who may not be aware that this is going to go on either, or what the potential is for happening in their community schools. So I hope that everyone will be looking for those messages to be coming from us beginning next week, and help us with spreading the word with the teachers in your life, with the superintendents in your life, with your neighbors, with your friends, of what is actually coming. The other thing that you can do, and that I would hope people would check out, is to help us with our efforts. I'm going to put a link to the AFRPEP website in the chat right now. There is a very convenient donation button that's there, and even very, very small donations or large ones, if you're so inclined or you're so able, can help us with those kinds of efforts. And I also just want to thank all of the panelists for joining us today too. The fact that you're willing to take the time to do this for us and help to inform the public, it says a lot about you, and I personally appreciate it. Also, just as an aside, because this is like one of my interest areas too, and I've been trying to inform people about this. Beth's slides alluded to this too. All of this stuff is written down in Project 2025 and has been since 2022. This is the 8th edition of the Mandate for Leadership that the Heritage Foundation publishes. ECA, the ECA bill is referenced directly in Project 2025. And if you ever think that they're not actually going to do it, they've already accomplished 51% of that over 900-page policy document. They're going to do it. They're going to do every single bit of it. The stuff that's going on in Greenland, the stuff that's going on in Venezuela, and all the stuff that's going on with the privatization of public education is written down. All we had to do was read it and believe them. So with that, I will give it back over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Rob, and I appreciate the messaging. We need to be aware that this is a long-range plan that's been developed over decades. I want to thank Chris Stifler. I love your Facebook reminder for Facebook buddies. Make sure we're talking to across the lawn and Facebook, as well as, however you're communicating with people. Patrick Kremen from the Education Law Center. Excellent start for us. Beth Lewis, thanks to you for the work you're doing in Arizona. We really appreciate your insight for what's happened. State Representative Eliza Hamrick, thank you for your advocacy and for your thoughtful consideration at the legislature. And last but not least, Kevin Wellner, thank you for your expertise and for your messaging that keep us informed. Judy Solano, thank you for your work. And you have the last word. We just want to say we appreciate everyone being here this evening. And please keep the faith, keep optimism, as much as it's hard to have these days. We can be a voice for sane, important, powerful public education, because that's what we're trying to protect and support. Judy, you're on mute.
I'd just like to remind everyone that this webinar was recorded, and it will be on our website soon. And the best thing you can do is start sending this out to everybody you know. And that is a really good way to get some people informed. So with that, I want to say thank you so much to everybody. This was a great webinar, and we're all in the same fight. So let's get out there and spread the word. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judy.